Good afternoon, students. Today is Tuesday, 6 April 2021. This will be our first lecture of the week. I expect to put the second lecture up on Friday this week. And of course, I'll let you know by email when the lectures have been posted. Today we're going to get started on a new essay by David Shaw. The title is Cryoethics, Seeking Life After Death. This essay was published in 2009, just 10 or 11 or 12 years ago, I guess. I posted the essay on Canvas several days ago. I hope you've had time to read, let's say, at least half of it by now. If you have not read any of it, then you should pause this video right now, go retrieve the essay, and read at least half of it before today's lecture, and then come back when you're done with that. We have 3 days total on this essay, so I'm going to break it up into 3 roughly equal chunks. And today, my main goal is to tell you a little bit about Shaw, to introduce the topic by discussing some terminology with you to make sure you understand the terminology. And then we're going to get started looking at some of the arguments. Today we'll just cover a couple of arguments, and then when we meet again later this week, we'll pick up where we left off. What else can I say? I've posted a number of things on Canvas for you regarding this topic. Now, first of all, I put up some notes and statistics on the second exam. So look it over. It shows you how the class as a whole did, and you can therefore see how you did in relation to your classmates. Again, the grade you receive in this course has nothing to do with how other people do in this course, but I assume that you're interested in how you stand relative to others. I've also posted, besides the essay by Shaw, I went ahead and posted my lecture notes on this essay so you can follow along. And I posted a handout that I prepared for you entitled Arguments for and Against Cryonics. And I'll explain what that word means in a moment. So what I tried to do is incorporate all of the arguments that we're going to be discussing in the next 3 lectures. I wanted to get all of them in one handout. In fact, I got all of them on one page by shrinking the size of the font. So you can look at that one handout and see all of the different arguments. Some of the arguments are ethical arguments. Some of them are what Shaw calls prudential arguments. Some of the arguments are in favor of cryonics, and some of them are against cryonics. So there end up being 4 categories on the handout. And I also posted just today a link to the website of a corporation called Alcor. It's mentioned by Shaw in his article. Alcor is located in Arizona, I believe in Scottsdale, and Alcor specializes in preserving either whole bodies or just the heads of bodies. And I'll tell you more about Alcor as we go along, but I thought you could, if you want, you can go there to Canvas, click on the link that I provided, and look around their website, read some of the things that are there. As of today, it looks like they have 181 patients or clients, people who have contracted with them to preserve their bodies or just the heads of their bodies. And the hope is that one day the technology will exist to revive them, to bring them back to life. It could be hundreds of years from now or thousands of years. Anyway, you can take a look at the website of Alcor. I assume that there are other companies besides Alcor, but that may be the main one. Okay, so let's get started. Again, we'll take about 1/3 of the material for today. Now let me tell you a little bit about David Shaw. His full name is David Martin Shaw. He's Scottish by birth. He was born in Scotland in 1977. So that would make him, 44 years ago. 44 years old sometime this year. As of this month, or the previous month when I looked it up, he was bioethicist in the Department of Health, Ethics, and Society at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, or Holland. He also has an interesting position in Switzerland. He is senior researcher at the Institute for Biomedical Ethics at the University of Basel in Switzerland. So he has, in effect, two different jobs. I don't know how he divides his time up. Possibly he spends half of a year in Switzerland and the other half of the year in the Netherlands or something like that. He has a lot of degrees in a lot of different subjects. He's very learned. He has a Master of Arts degree with honors in philosophy and English literature from the University of Glasgow, which is a great old city in Scotland. He then went on to earn a postgraduate certificate in education from the University of Strathclyde, also in Glasgow. From there, he earned a Master of Science degree in philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. So far, all three of his degrees or certificates are in Scotland. He then went to Switzerland to earn a Doctor and Letters degree in philosophy from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland. And he didn't stop there. He evidently wanted to learn more about the law, which is an important aspect of bioethics. So he earned a master's degree in medical law from the School of Law at the University of Glasgow. So 4 of his 5 degrees or certificates are from Scottish universities, and 1 is from a Swiss university. He's the author of at least 1 book. In 2006, his book entitled Genetic Morality was published. And and by the way, a reviewer, Hugh McLaughlin, described it as, quote, a very well-written and absorbing book. So that's high praise from another philosopher. Now, Shaw has published a number of essays in a number of different areas, on a number of different topics. So let me get my copy. This is my copy of Shaw's essay. Had to get it out of my notebook. And if you look at the final page where there's information about Shaw, it says he is interested in all areas of bioethics and has published articles on the following topics: euthanasia, embryo research, disability, consent, cloning, placebos, virtue ethics, professionalism, health inequalities, circumcision, HIV, and private versus public health care. That's a wide range of topics. So obviously what Shaw does, since he's interested in all of these topics within biomedical ethics, whenever he gets sufficiently interested, he sets out to write an article on that topic. He does the research, I'm sure, finds out what the arguments are for and against various positions on that topic, and then writes his articles. So he's a prolific author, and we're reading an essay that he wrote on what he calls cryoethics. So let me get started with some of the terminology. You can see it if you printed out my lecture notes. You can follow along. I've got a great many words that begin with cryo. So we need to know what that prefix means. The prefix cryo, cryo, means extreme cold, and it's from a Greek word. The English prefix cryo comes from the Greek word kruos, K-R-U-O-S, and that word means frost, and so it makes sense. We needed a word in English to refer to extreme cold, so we looked back at a classical language, Greek, and we chose a word, the Greek word kruos, which means frost. And frost, of course, is very cold. So keep that in mind. Cryo means extreme cold, comes from a Greek word, kruos. Let's move on now. Cryogenics. Now this is a word that's not made up by Shaw. This is a word that's been around for some time. In fact, I looked it up in my Oxford American Dictionary and Language Guide, which was published in 1999. And here's what I found. Cryogenics, notice it has that prefix cryo. Cryogenics is, quote, the branch of physics dealing with the production and effects of very low temperatures. So physicists, of all people, study the effects of and the production of very cold temperatures. And those physicists who work in that area say that they're working in cryogenics. And maybe they even call themselves cryogenicists, right? Or cryogeneticist, perhaps, cryogenics. So cryogenics is a subfield of physics, which is one of the hard sciences. Let's move on. Cryobiology, and I looked it up in my Oxford American Dictionary, the same dictionary. Cryobiology is, quote, the biology of organisms below their normal temperatures. So certain biologists have as their specialty studying organisms, anything from insects to earthworms to mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and so on, maybe even primates, maybe even human beings. This branch of biology studies organisms at or below their normal temperatures. So what happens to an insect when it's exposed to sub-freezing temperatures? Does it become lethargic? Does it stop moving? Does it change its behavior in some way? Maybe it burrows into the ground or finds a shelter from the cold or the wind or the snow. Maybe it dies. At what temperature will a given insect die? I'm sure that has been tested by these biologists. So cryobiology is another subfield in science, this time within the branch called biology. Okay, let's turn to cryosurgery. The same dictionary defines the word cryosurgery as, quote, surgery using the local application of intense cold for anesthesia or therapy, unquote. So cryosurgery is surgery that makes use of this special technique, cold temperatures, as a form of anesthesia or even as therapy. Perhaps freezing a wound will increase the healing powers of the body or something to that effect. So cryosurgery is a branch of surgery or a special type of surgery that involves cold temperatures. Let's now turn to cryonics. Cryonics is a term that was invented by, well, I probably shouldn't say this because I'm not sure. Maybe Shaw coined the word cryonics. I'm starting to think he probably did not. That would be my guess. Cryonics is, if you read Shaw on page 515, he describes cryonics as the practice of, quote, freezing bodies or brains for future reanimation, unquote. Again, I'm not sure where that word came from. Shaw may have invented it, but maybe he did not. Maybe someone else did. But that's the meaning of the word. Freezing, the practice of freezing bodies or just the brains of those bodies for future reanimation. That's called cryonics. Now, let's say a few more things about cryonics. Cryonics, which is the freezing of the body or the brain, is an alternative to other ways of disposing of dead bodies. And the two main ways of disposing of dead bodies, at least in our culture, are burial underground and cremation, where the body is burned to ashes, and the ashes can then be stored or disposed of. So cryonics can be viewed as an alternative to those traditional techniques for disposal of dead bodies. Now, I mentioned Alcor. I put up a link to their website. Alcor is, according to Shaw, the largest cryonics company. And I have here in my notes, you can see it, read material from the company's website. And I may do that in a few minutes. I have material here in my notebook. One of the case studies is very interesting, so I'll try to remember to discuss it with you at the end of this lecture today. Let's now turn to what's called cryonic suspension. Cryonic suspension, according to Shaw, is, quote, cooling the body to minus 196 degrees Celsius while using cryopreservant to attempt to prevent preservation injury. So the idea is that the body, once the person in question dies, and as soon as possible after death, the body or just the brain of the body is subjected to these very cold temperatures. A preservant is applied to the body or to the brain to prevent what's called preservation injury. It's to try to keep the tissues intact so that they don't degrade any further than they already have. So very, very cold temperatures. I hope you can see that. Now, I didn't do a conversion to Fahrenheit. This is Celsius or centigrade, but it would be very cold whether you measure it with Fahrenheit or Celsius. So that's called cryonic suspension. That's when you freeze the body as a whole or some part of it, like the brain, by applying a preservant to it and freezing it immediately. And finally, neuropreservation. This is the procedure whereby only part of the body is preserved or frozen, and typically it's the brain. Okay, so neuro, N-E-U-R-O, obviously refers to the neurons in the brain. So remember, either the whole body can be frozen, and Alcor has many of those, or just part of the body, such as the brain. When the brain alone is frozen, for example, when the head is severed from the body upon death, and the whole head frozen, with the brain intact, that's called neuropreservation. Are you starting to get the creeps a little bit from this topic? I must confess, when I first located this article, and by the way, this article was published in a very good journal, in case you're wondering. The journal is Bioethics. It's one of the top journals in the field of biomedical ethics. So this was a topic that I'm sure the editors thought was timely and important, and may become more important as time goes by. This procedure may catch on. More and more people may undertake it. So the editors must have thought that it would be useful to look at arguments for and against having your body frozen. And Shaw is a good writer. He wrote it up clearly. He was fair, I think, in setting forth all the arguments he could think of on either side of the issue. Now, he makes his own position is clear. It's not as though he's just surveying the arguments on both sides. He believes that cryopreservation is morally permissible, and that individuals who want to engage in that practice may do so legally and morally. So Shaw has a point of view, and we'll see more of it as we go along. Okay, a couple more terms. We're not done with the terminology yet. The term cryoethics does appear to be an invention of David Shaw. In other words, he coined this term. I think the term cryonics had been around for some time, and Shaw said, we need a word for the ethics of cryonic preservation. And he put the two terms together, cryo, meaning extreme cold, and ethics, and coined the term cryoethics. And here's how he defines it. Cryoethics is the ethics of the rights and wrongs of cryonics. It's the moral dimension of the practice known as cryonics. And it's something that philosophers are specially equipped to discuss. Philosophers who specialize in ethics are well versed in the many theories of ethics that have been developed. Philosophers who specialize in ethics are typically used to applying those theories to practical topics, which is called applied ethics. Philosophers are specially equipped to work in this area that Shaw calls cryoethics. And you can see that he himself has not only legal expertise, but philosophical expertise. His Master of Arts degree in honors is in philosophy and English literature. He also has a Master of Science degree in philosophy. And he has a Doctor and Letters degree in philosophy. So 3 of his 5 degrees or certificates are in philosophy. So he is a philosopher and he works in ethics. And so this topic is right up his alley. And finally, there's the word cryonaut. Now, all of you have used the word or heard the word astronaut. An astronaut is a space traveler. A cryonaut might be thought of as a time traveler. A cryonaut is someone who has his or her body or brain frozen in the hope of being reanimated at some future time, maybe hundreds or thousands of years from now. So just as an astronaut travels from place to place in the solar system or in the galaxy, a cryonaut travels over time from today, where death occurs, to some future point, some distant future time at which reanimation will occur or may occur. So a cryonaut is the person who undergoes the procedure. Other names for a cryonaut are simply the person who is frozen. That would be a pretty bland description. You could call the cryonaut the freezee. So we have the freezer, that would be the company like Alcor that does the freezing of the body. And the person whose body is frozen, we can call the freezee. Now, I don't like that as much as cryonaut. I think cryonaut is a nice term. It has parallels with astronaut. You might also call a cryonaut a revivee, someone who is hoping to be revived and rejuvenated at some future date. Okay, you may have noted if you're looking at my lecture notes, I have a note to myself, show video of Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer, which is a skit that occurred. There were multiple, it was a recurring skit on Saturday Night Live many years ago. And I know it's available on YouTube, so if you want, just for a chuckle, type in YouTube, Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer, and watch a short video or two. It's quite funny. It involves a man who looks like a caveman with a beard and very rough features. I think he's played by Phil Hartman, and some of his exploits are funny. For example, somehow he becomes a lawyer, and when he's in court before a jury trying a personal injury case, he pretends that he doesn't know much about the law. He says over and over again, "But what do I know? I'm just an unfrozen caveman lawyer." So it's his shtick. He is appealing to the sympathies of the jury, hoping that they will sympathize with his predicament of being a caveman and give him a favorable verdict. So he's obviously a successful lawyer who plays upon and uses his caveman status for personal success. Anyway, it's very funny, and it involves a caveman who was trapped in the ice long ago and discovered recently he was thawed out or unfrozen, and now he lives among us. And that's exactly what the cryonauts are hoping, right? They're freezing themselves on purpose upon their death, and they hope one day to be revived or brought back to life by future peoples who may be very different. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. I mean, the future people may be as different from us today as we are from the caveman in the Saturday Night Live skit, right? And that could be a problem. How will we know how to communicate if we are revived long in the future, far in the future? Will we be able to communicate with them? We will be a curiosity to them. Maybe they will harm us or use us as pets or torture us and do painful things to us. Maybe they'll end up eating us, killing and eating us. So there are a lot of uncertainties involved in this procedure, and Shaw addresses some of them as he goes along. So be patient. We'll get to all of these things that you may be thinking of as we go. Now, let me kind of divide up the arguments and impose a little bit of a structure on them. Shaw, if you look at his article, let's take a look at the headings, because the headings show you how he himself divides up the topic, and they appear in a certain order, and that usually matters. First of all, he has an introduction. See the yellow highlighting I have here? He introduces the topic, which is a good thing to do when you're writing an article. On the second page, at the top of the first column, is the heading Prudential Arguments Against Cryonics. Okay, so these are arguments of a certain sort that push in a certain direction. He calls them prudential arguments. Elsewhere, he calls them practical arguments. Now, what does he mean by prudential? Prudence means looking out for your own interests or caring for your own welfare. Okay, I might say to you, it wouldn't be prudent for you to put off your studying until the night before the exam. Okay, in fact, I will say that to you. I won't say I might say that. I am going to say that to you. It is not prudent for you to put off your studying until the day before the third exam. Okay? Because you're going to have to do a lot of studying. You're going to get tired. Other things may come up to prevent you from studying, and then you're going to be lost when it comes to taking the exam the next day. So what I'm saying is, it's not in your interest to put off your studying. The studying should be done as you go between now and the third exam. So notice, I'm appealing not to right and wrong. I'm appealing to you and your interests. That's called a prudential argument. In effect, I'm giving you useful advice. I'm saying, if you care about your grade in this course, then you would be well advised to study all along instead of putting it off until the end. So a prudential argument is an argument that appeals to the self-interest of the person to whom you are making that argument. You with me? In a moment, we're going to look at a different kind of argument that contrasts with that. And once again, we're looking at this section. This section of the essay contains only prudential arguments, and specifically those that are against cryonics. So what Shaw is listing in this section is every argument he can think of why it's not in someone's best interest in the long run to have his or her body frozen. Okay, and there are several arguments that fall into this category. Okay, turn the page. On the third page down here, you'll see a heading called Ethical Objections to Cryonics. Now, these are still arguments against cryonics, against having your body frozen. But these arguments do not appeal to the self-interest of the freezee or the cryonaut. These arguments appeal to ethical considerations, to right and wrong. These arguments say that it would be wrong to have your body frozen because of the effect of doing that on other people, your children, your family, other people in society. Okay, so we started off with prudential arguments against cryonics. This section discusses ethical arguments against cryonics. All right, turn a couple of pages and you'll see a heading down here entitled Arguments in Favor of Cryonics. And in this section, Shaw lumps together prudential arguments and ethical arguments. He He doesn't have separate sections for them. He puts them in one section. And then on the final page, conclusion. So that's the basic structure of Shaw's essay. Notice, there are 4 kinds of arguments. There are prudential arguments against cryonics. There are prudential arguments in favor of cryonics. There are ethical arguments against cryonics. And there are ethical arguments in favor of cryonics. That's it. That's the gist of the essay. Arguments for and against cryonics. And on the handout that I posted for you, I've summarized all of the arguments in 4 boxes. So it should be easy to understand what Shaw is up to. Okay, let's get back to where I started this discussion. What are these prudential arguments against cryonics? I told you that they appeal to the self-interest of the prospective cryonaut. And what I mean by that is the person who is thinking about having his or her body frozen upon death. Now, there are really 2 types of prudential argument. Listen carefully now. One type of argument says to the prospective cryonaut, you shouldn't do it. It's not in your interest because you won't benefit from it. It won't help you in any way. It won't promote your well-being or your happiness. Therefore, it would be a waste of money for you to do it. It's expensive to have your body frozen. Just go to Alcor's website and see how much they charge. Although it occurs to me they may not tell you on the website. You probably have to call them and start discussing with somebody. They may not put the price out front on the website, but Shaw informs the reader that it is quite expensive to undergo this procedure. So imagine you thinking about having your body frozen upon death and paying a large sum of money. Someone who cares about you may say you shouldn't do it. It's not in your interest to do it because it'll cost you a lot of money and there's probably going to be no benefit for you from doing it. Right? It's probably not going to work. That's the first prudential argument, the first type of prudential argument. The second type of prudential argument goes further. It says you shouldn't do it because it will harm you in some way. Not just that it won't be of any benefit, but it will actually make things worse for you. It will harm you. It will set back your interest in some way, your financial interests or perhaps some other interest that you have. And I mentioned this at the top of page 2 so you can follow along. Now here's what I want to do for the rest of today. I want to look at only the first 2 arguments in this section. And remember, I have 3 days to cover this essay, so I don't want to do everything at once. I'd like to just introduce the topic today and get started on the arguments. And I think 2 will be enough. When we meet again on Friday this week, we will pick up where we left off and continue covering the next third of the essay. And then next week at about this time, when we finish up Shaw, we will finish the third of the essay. So let's get started. Remember, these are now prudential arguments against cryonics. Okay, they're one of the 4 types. The first argument we might call the loneliness argument. The loneliness argument. And you may, without even having read the essay, although I hope you have by now, you may be able to guess how this argument goes. It goes like this, and I'm going to quote Shaw from page 516. Shaw says, and remember, this isn't necessarily Shaw himself saying this. He's thought up all of the arguments on both sides, and he's putting words in the mouth of someone who is critical of cryonics. Okay, so don't assume this is Shaw himself saying this. He wrote it, but he wrote it as though someone else were saying it. Here's what he wrote. Quote, there would be no point in being revived in a few hundred years, as all your family and friends would be dead. So you would be very much alone. And typically when you're alone, you are lonely. That's why this is called the loneliness argument. Because you will be alone in this future time once you become revived or brought back to life, your family and friends, the people around you now who give your life meaning and with whom you do things that are enjoyable, they won't be there. So you're going to be very lonely in that new world in which you find yourself. Surely it's not in your interest in the long run to be lonely, especially for a long time. So I hope you can see why this is a prudential argument against cryonics. The critic says to the prospective cryonaut, you really shouldn't do it. Even if it works, it might not work, but even if it does, you're going to be terribly, terribly lonely, and you'll wish you were dead. Here's what Shaw says in reply to that argument. And you could probably think of some replies yourself. He has 3 replies, and I'll go over them one at a time. Number 1, Shaw says, family and friends can also be frozen. Maybe you thought of that. If I could be frozen and brought back to life 500 years from now, then my family members and friends can do the same. And we could stipulate when we turn our bodies over to Alcor or whatever company is doing the freezing, we can stipulate that we be revived at the same time so we can be together again. Okay? So that's the first reply. What it says is, no, I won't necessarily be lonely. Okay? Because I may have one or more family members there with me and one or more friends. Maybe the whole gang will be back together. Remember the movie The Breakfast Club? Right? It was about a group of young people. I think they were on detention or something, and they got to know each other very well and came to like each other. What if a group of friends like that, agreed that upon their deaths they would be frozen and all would be revived at the same time? Well, that would be a wonderful thing, wouldn't it? They could spend many, many years together, maybe an eternity together in their breakfast club, right? Enjoying each other's company and so on. Okay, that's the first reply Shaw thinks up. Here's the second one. He says, and I'm going to quote him here, you are quite likely to prefer a friendless existence to none at all, unquote. Let's think about that for a moment. The critic of cryonics says, you shouldn't do it because you're going to be awfully lonely. The implication is that you'd rather be dead than lonely. Shaw says, wait a minute, that doesn't follow. Maybe I'd rather be alive and lonely than dead. Right? At least if I'm alive, I may be lonely, but I'm able to do things. There will be other people around me I can get to know, and there will presumably be activities for me to engage in. Some of the things I enjoy doing now, like reading or riding my bike, I could do those in that future world. So maybe I can avoid loneliness by staying busy, right, and doing things. So that's the second response. Shaw says loneliness may be a bad condition to be in, but it's preferable to the alternative, which is death, which is non-existence. Okay, third reply made by Shaw, and I'm going to quote him again from page 516. Shaw says, quote, there's nothing to prevent the thawed out freezee from making new friends and perhaps contacting the descendants of his old family, unquote. Well, let's think about that. You're thinking, the critic says you're going to be very lonely, but why must you be lonely? Even if your old family and friends aren't there with you, people do make new friends, don't they? When you move from one town to another, you lose your old friends. You may stay in touch with them somehow, but often you lose contact with your neighbors and friends. And what do? You're in a new home in a new city, you make new friends. Maybe the new friends are as good as or better than the old friends in terms of enhancing your life and enriching your life. So, if you're frozen and revived in the future, your friends and family may not be there with you, but there will be other people there with you. If there weren't, then you wouldn't have been revived. There would have been nobody to revive you. And so you can mingle, associate, and make new friends and learn from them and enjoy their company and so on. All the things you do now with the friends you currently have. And notice the twist. You can contact the descendants of your old family. So you can look people up. Maybe genealogy will have advanced significantly, and maybe you can go to the local library and get on the computer, and you can trace the descendants of your old friends from before you were frozen. And you can find where they live, knock on their door. Can you imagine the conversation? Hello, you don't know me. In fact, I've just been revived. I was in a state of suspended animation for a long, long time, hundreds of years. But back in the day, before I was frozen, I knew or was related to certain people, and you descended from them. So you're the descendant of my best friend, or you're the descendant of my brothers and sisters, or some other relative. Now, they might slam the door in your face at that point and say, this is too creepy, leave. I don't want anything to do with you. But they might be intrigued, let you in, and learn your story, find it fascinating, and they might welcome you into the bosom of their family, right? You're kind of kin, aren't you? They've descended from your friends or family members. So it could be a welcoming experience for you. And that might take away some of your loneliness. You don't have your actual friends and family, but you have their descendants. And they may befriend you, take you in, invite you over for family gatherings and so on. Okay, so all of that was just the first argument, and I'm calling it the loneliness argument. And I hope by now you can see what Shaw is doing. He's thinking up arguments, in this case a prudential argument against cryonics, specifically that you will be lonely, and then he's racking his brain. He's saying, what can be said in response to that loneliness argument? And he thought of 3 replies to it. It's pretty ingenious when you think about it. Now, I'm not saying that the replies are adequate. I'm not making that kind of judgment, and he doesn't either. But you can see that there is a give and take here. Right? It's not as though as soon as the loneliness argument is made, everyone accepts it. No, you don't have to accept it. You can fight back and try to reply to it. And I'll leave it to you whether the arguer or the critic gets the better of it. You might, having heard the whole argument and the replies, you might think that the loneliness argument is still has some force to it. Or you might think that the replies are effective and that the loneliness argument turns out to be pretty weak. Now, I'm not going to test you on which side you take. When I write my exam questions for this part of the course, I'm going to see how well you understand the arguments and the replies to the arguments. At no point will I say who gets the better of it, the arguer or the critic. I won't ask for your judgment or your opinion. Really, it doesn't matter at all to me, and I certainly can't and won't test you on that. But I do want you to understand all the arguments and the replies to them, okay? Now, let's do one more argument today, and then we'll break it off and pick up where we left off on Friday. The second argument is known as the expense argument. And as you might guess, it has to do with how expensive this procedure is. After all, our wealth is limited. It's finite. What if having your body frozen consumed the majority of your wealth? Arguably, that's not in your best interest, right? To spend so much money on an unproven procedure. So here, according to Shaw, is the argument, the expense argument. It's still on page 516. Quote, "It won't be cheap to keep the temperature of your body or brainstem close to absolute zero for hundreds of years. That won't be cheap. Just think of the electricity that will be required. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, year after year after year. That's a lot of electricity to keep the temperature down. Remember, Alcor is in the desert in Arizona, in Scottsdale, where the temperatures reach routinely 110 degrees throughout the summer. I lived for 5 years in Tucson, which is not even as hot as Phoenix and Scottsdale, but we routinely hit 100 or 105 degrees almost every day for months on end, June, July, August. So I can testify how hot it is. The electricity needed in these facilities to keep the body at that very, very cold temperature will cost a lot of money, maybe more in the future. Maybe electricity will be more expensive in the future for various reasons we don't need to go into. So what the critic is saying now is, you really shouldn't have your body frozen. It's going to cost an arm and a leg. And while you may be able to afford it, it's going to consume a great percentage of your wealth that will take away from other things you might do with that money. Right? Maybe you'll have to cut back on many other things. You might have to sell your house and buy a smaller house or live in an apartment. You might have to give up your car because of the expensiveness of it and take Uber or Lyft or public transportation. And that might come as a cost to you. Maybe you prefer driving and owning a car. So the critic is telling you, look, think this through. It's going to cost you a lot of money to have this procedure done, and that's not in your long-term best interest. Okay, so this is the expense argument. Once again, Shaw thinks of some replies to it. This time he comes up with a couple, 2. Here's what he says first. He says, quote, "Cryonics is indeed quite expensive, and many people will not be able to afford it. But in fact, it is not so expensive that it is only an option for millionaires." Unquote. So what's Shaw saying? In part, he's agreeing with the arguer, isn't he? Yeah, it's expensive. And it's not for everybody. Right? Not everybody can afford it. But some can. And not just millionaires either. You could afford it even if you are less than a millionaire. Maybe you have worked hard throughout your life and accumulated savings, which you can use for whatever purpose you please. If you want to use a big chunk of your savings for cryopreservation, to freeze your body or part of your body, it might not put you into a state of poverty. You'll still have an adequate, comfortable life, even though you've designated a big chunk of your money for this procedure. Okay, so that's his first reply. It's surprisingly cheap, right? It's surprisingly inexpensive. Look into it. You might find that it's cheaper than you think it is, the critic is saying. Okay, here's the second reply that Shaw thinks of to the expense argument. He says most people pay using their life insurance policies. Wow, that's interesting, isn't it? A life insurance policy has a beneficiary. Typically, you subscribe to a life insurance policy, meaning you pay premiums on a regular basis, monthly or yearly. You pay a certain amount of money to the insurance company, and when you die, a chunk of money will be given to whomever you name as your beneficiary. It could typically you name your spouse or your spouse and your children, If you have no spouse or children, you may name your parents or siblings or some worthy organization that you believe in. You can leave your money to anybody you want, or your life insurance proceeds to anybody you want. So why not use your life insurance proceeds to pay for your cryopreservation? It's perfect, isn't it? Because once you die, your life insurance is to be paid off. That's part of the agreement you made with the life insurance company. And why not just designate Elcor as the beneficiary of your life insurance? Elcor will be happy to take the money in that way. In fact, they recommend it. Go to their website. I'm sure somewhere in there they will say, you can pay for this procedure with your life insurance. Now, keep in mind that if you designate Elcor to take your life insurance proceeds, then whoever would be your second choice, a spouse or children or whomever, will not be getting that money. And that's a different argument. That one will take up under ethical arguments, because in that case, you are arguably affecting the interest of other people when you make the decision to have your body frozen. Other people who would otherwise be beneficiaries will not be beneficiaries if you give your proceeds to Elcor or some other company. So Shaw replies to this argument by saying that you can use your life insurance proceeds to pay for the procedure instead of using your life savings or whatever other money you have. Just stipulate that your life insurance proceeds will go to Elcor. And you won't be needing that money anyway, right? When you die, the life insurance proceeds simply go to somebody. We'll make it go to Elcor, and that'll pay that expense. Now, I have a query here in my notes. You may notice it. Does justice require equality or subsidization? What I mean by that is, whenever some good thing is available only to the wealthy, an argument could be made that that's not fair. Why should the wealthy have opportunities and advantages that are denied to people who are not wealthy? I can imagine somebody arguing on grounds of fairness or justice that if the rich are able to undergo this procedure, then society has an obligation to make it available to everyone, whether they can afford it themselves or not. Right? It's the way we treat food. We have welfare programs to ensure that nobody goes without food. You can get food stamps to buy food if you cannot afford food on your own. Where does the money come from? It comes from taxpayers all over the country. So the government collects tax receipts, and some of it goes to fund food programs to make sure everybody has adequate food. Well, maybe society should collect taxes and distribute them so that everyone has the same opportunity to have their body preserved and potentially revived in the future. So that's all I mean by that query. I wrote, does justice require equality? Should government subsidize the payments to Elcor so that everybody has the same opportunity? Why should a rich person have the chance for revival in the future and not some poor or working class person? Is that fair? If it's not fair, then maybe government should subsidize this procedure so that everyone can afford it. Make it affordable. It's like healthcare. We call it the Affordable Health Care Act. Right? We want everyone to have access to decent health care. We want it to be affordable for all. Maybe we should make cryopreservation affordable for all. And that's going to require that the government collect tax revenues and use them for that purpose of subsidizing. Okay, that's enough for today. I have a note that we're going to pick up next time with the next argument. Let me quickly turn to my notes. I have printed out some information from Elcor, and I want to give you a flavor for how this works. So I'm reading, here's what my printout looks like. I printed this out from the website of Alcor. It's called Alcor News. And you can see there in large type, it says Alcor's 117th patient. And I believe when I looked at the website today, I believe it said that there are 181 patients now. So in just a few years, maybe 3 or 4 years since I printed this, they've gone from 117 patients to 181. So the company's growing, the more money's coming in. They're probably working on their procedures to make them more efficient and more affordable. But listen to this story. This is a particular case. Obviously, they're not going to name someone for privacy reasons. Listen to this. This is written by someone at Alcor. April 2013, which is 8 years ago. At 99 years old, whole body Alcor member A2419, confidential, became one of the oldest individuals to ever be cryopreserved, with only 2 other members being slightly older. Living in St. Louis, Missouri for his entire life, he served the Army Air Force during World War II and was awarded 2 Bronze Service Stars. So we've got a decorated World War II veteran who's very old, lived in St. Louis, Missouri. For most people in their 90s, any serious health complication can be life-threatening. Alcor closely monitored the health of this individual when he entered into a long-term care facility in 2009. Due to numerous bouts of pneumonia, hospitalization became a frequent and troubling concern for Alcor's deployment committee. That's what they call it, a deployment committee, in determining when a standby response might be needed. In September 2011, Aaron Drake and Steve Graber of Alcor were deployed to St. Louis for a 3-day standby when physicians were gravely concerned over the members' health. Fortunately, a strong recovery ensued and the standby was terminated. So are you following along so far? Evidently, this person entered into a contract with Alcor to freeze his body upon his death. So Alcor has to be prepared. They need to monitor him, and the moment he dies, they need to swoop in with their deployment team and claim his body, get it to Scottsdale, Arizona as quickly as possible before it starts to degrade, and get it frozen. So Alcor is contractually obligated to get this man's body or brain preserved as quickly as possible. That means they've got to monitor him. Whenever he gets sick, they've got to be on alert. Okay, here's the final paragraph. On March 6, 2013, as Alcor was in the middle of performing a cryopreservation of their 116th patient, we received a call from the member's family that A2419's health was failing, and they expected him to pass within the next week. So the family is alerting Alcor that the end may be near. After discussing the situation in more depth with medical providers in charge of our members' care, Alcor's deployment committee decided to send suspended animation to initiate a standby on the following day. That's what they call it, suspended animation. After 4 days, the member succumbed to his illness. So they waited around for 4 days. Finally, the man died. Directed by Catherine Baldwin, suspended animation immediately performed stabilization, cool down, and field washout procedures. So when I said swooped in, they were ready to go. They got to the body immediately upon his death and started working on it, procedures to cool it down and get it prepared, washed out for the freezing process. To further avoid any potential delays associated with commercial airline shipping, The family provided additional funds for a private jet service to fly the patient directly to Scottsdale. So time is of the essence, right? You really, St. Louis to Scottsdale, long way. Don't risk a commercial airline. You know, they sometimes have delays, canceled flights. The family paid for a private jet to get that body to Scottsdale as quickly as possible. The patient arrived at Elcor 7 hours after cardiac arrest, and the cryoprotective surgery began 15 minutes later. On March 10th, 2013, A2419 joined his wife at Elcor, who was also cryopreserved in 2009. There you go. That's what Shaw was talking about. This man's wife had already had her body cryopreserved. He now has had his body cryopreserved. I'm sure in their contract with Elcor, they stipulated that neither one of them be revived without the other. So at whatever time they're to be revived in the future, they will both be revived. The hope is that they can resume their lives together, and neither one will be lonely, or as lonely as they might have without his or her spouse. So that shows you this is not science fiction. This is science. I mean, there's a science behind these procedures, and you can look into it. Elcor explains it on its website. Let me mention one more thing before we break for the day. Have you ever heard of Ted Williams? Ted Williams is regarded as one of the greatest baseball players of all time. Maybe the greatest. He's right up there with Babe Ruth, Joe DiMaggio, Lou Gehrig, Ty Cobb, and other great players. Certainly one of the top 10, I would say, if not higher ranked. Ted Williams, who had looked into this cryopreservation, wanted his body frozen. Actually, not his body, but just his brain. And when he died in 2002, at the age of 84, his head was severed from the body and frozen. And I believe Elcor has Ted Williams's head frozen in a container, and the hope is that one day he will be revived. And maybe, I don't know how it will work. He died as an old man. Is it conceivable that he could be revived as a young man? And if baseball is still being played several hundred years from now, or whenever he's revived, maybe people at that time will be able to see Ted Williams play baseball again. Now that's one of the great unanswered questions. People say, if I die at 84 or 99, as this patient was, when I'm revived, won't I just be an old, feeble man or woman? Well, maybe. But maybe medical procedures, maybe science will have advanced so much in the succeeding centuries, or whatever time elapses between freezing and revival. Maybe there will be a way to make you younger, right? So Ted Williams won't be 84 when he's revived. Maybe he'll be revived with a 25-year-old body. It'll be Ted Williams's brain in a 25-year-old body again. And that's what I meant when I said maybe he could play some baseball in the future. Okay, I know you're probably thinking you're dreaming, or you've picked up a science fiction novel by mistake, and your professor's gone crazy. I don't think that's the case. I don't think I've gone crazy. I'm getting all this from an article published by a reputable philosopher in a reputable journal, one of the very best journals in the field. And while it has a science fiction aspect to it, it does have a scientific basis to some extent. There is arguably a science behind this, and we'll talk more about that later. And who knows what will happen in the future? If you look back 500 years at the state of science and medicine, it's staggering how much change has occurred. We now have vaccines to stave off smallpox and other diseases. People live much longer than they did 500 years ago, on average. People routinely live over 100 years now. Well, maybe routinely is not the right word, but it's not unheard of for someone to reach the age of 100 or even more, 110. I'm sure nobody 500 years ago lived that long. Nobody in the world. But it happens now far more often than it ever did. So maybe this seems science fiction-y right now, but it's at least something to think about. And why not apply our philosophical abilities and start looking at the arguments? Because if this becomes a more and more realistic procedure, we don't want there to be a lag between the procedures and the ethics of it. So Shaw is trying to get the ethics up to speed. We should be looking at this from an ethical point of view, and that's the purpose of this article. All right, we're an hour and 5 minutes into the lecture. I hope you find this interesting, as I do. I've taught it several times now, this article. I think the students respond well to it. I've heard chuckling in the classroom when we discuss some of these things, but that's okay. These procedures are kind of far-fetched, but it's meant to be a serious essay, so we'll take it seriously. I'll see you on probably Friday this week. Make sure by Friday you've read the whole article before you watch my next video. And we'll cover about the next third of the article. Okay, have a great day. See you Friday.